let us move on with the representative of the UNHCR, Mr. Andreas Wisner. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an honor to be here with you. Let me just finish setting up my presentation that we have prepared to illustrate a few facts, especially regarding UNHCR's humanitarian response to the recent displacement situation. Okay. Following the recent escalation of this decade-long conflict in the region, the government of Armenia reported that between 24 September and 4 October, 100,632 refugees, including 30,000 children, arrived in Armenia. And that was an average of 15,000 people per day, with a peak of 40,000 on 27 September alone. So far, the government has registered more than 98,000 refugees in government-run registration centers, but the arrival has largely ceased as of the 1st of October. Overall, the number of new arrivals constitute now 3.3% of the entire Armenian population, which is just less than 3 million. That means 1 in 30 people are refugees and newly arrived refugees, which adds to Armenia's already pre-existing refugee population of around 35,000, most of them from the previous conflict in 2020. UNHCR has been on the ground from the beginning. We have an office there in Armenia since 1992, providing immediate assistance and assessing the situation of refugees' needs in support of the government-led response. The newly arrived refugees are mostly confused and very apprehensive about their future. They don't know what will happen to their homes that they have left and whether they will return there one day. They're anxious about what will happen to them now and worry about their children and whether they would have access to education. Most of them, because of the rush of their departure, they came with very few belongings and require urgent emergency assistance like blankets, bedding materials, medication, psychosocial support, and shelter in the immediate term. Many, including the children and elderly persons, are traumatized and in need of mental health and psychological support. Several are also worried about elderly family members who stayed behind as they were unable or unwilling to abandon their houses or even their animals that are very dear to many Armenians from Karabakh. Many refugees have a rural background who left behind their livestock, which is now left roaming around, risking to perish in the cold weather of the winter when it sets in. And similar applies also to many pets that had to be abandoned in the panic of departure for lack of transportation opportunities. The government of Armenia has been making consistent and commendable efforts to register the newly arrived and meet their rapidly growing needs. In support of this exemplary government-led response, UNHCR is leading the interagency refugee response, working with the resident coordinator's office, the other UN agencies and NGOs. There are sectoral working groups in place under which UNHCR is leading the one on the global one, intersectoral working group, and sectoral working groups on protection, shelter, and core relief items, non-food items. However, further support and funding from the international community is urgently needed. Therefore, to ensure more predictable funding, at least over the coming 6 months and hopefully beyond, a refugee response plan or emergency and resilience appeal was launched on 7 October. And as you see at a glance, some figures contained in that report, based on 136,000 refugees in Armenia, and also to be assisted 95,500 local persons assisting them. International community is appealing for $97 million for a total of, on behalf of a total of 16 partners, most of them local NGOs. This plan supports and complements the government response and aligns activities of all actors, which will also take into account the upcoming expected harsh winter months when critical support will be required. This response plan stresses that not only immediate emergency response needs, but also medium and long-term needs must be considered, which is typical in refugee situations like this one. Humanitarian assistance should be followed by progressive integration of refugees in national systems, which includes strengthening of public services. And finally, humanitarian assistance should merge into development assistance so that it can be gradually phased out while national institutions are strengthened, especially in places that are mostly affected by refugee arrival. Maybe I can just introduce briefly a few of the sectors where UNHCR and the government are partnering to meet the most urgent needs. Specifically, with regard to registration, the government has done an exemplary job with some IT assistance from UNHCR. Then when we come to accommodation and assistance, which is one of UNHCR's specialties, there is an urgent need of a repair of existing shelters. The housing available for emergency accommodation is in short supply. So all these relief items that UNHCR and partners can provide are really most urgently needed at this stage, especially since many refugees had to be accommodated in remote areas where they're unlikely to find livelihood opportunities, but in remote areas far away from the capitals, empty houses were more likely to be available. But then assistance and relief items are all the more important to meet the basic needs of the people that have found shelter there. The government has in the meantime already received 58,000 requests for shelter support, and that need to be attended to in a joint effort. UNHCR is actively involved in protection monitoring at all locations where refugees are located. You see here on the map where the main distribution of refugees at this time. There's a trend for refugees to settle close to the capital, Yerevan, and also in a bit in the southern Syunik area. But really, where livelihood is available, refugees tend to move towards. So we also act in the mental health and psychological support sector, which is extremely important given the psychological condition of this population who have been uprooted all of a sudden and who have not really found a foothold really in their new host country. There is a plan under the response plan to, and it's already being done, to establish service points, child-friendly spaces, but also women and children centers, peer support networks to mitigate the impact of being displaced all of a sudden, the psychological impact. This is a rather traditional population. I've been told they are not so much interested in having psychological one-to-one support, but more in a mental health support, more on a community basis. So this is what is being put in place now together with the authorities. In terms of education, for the time being, 40% of the new arriving refugee children have already been enrolled, but this is not enough. This is a rather low enrollment because this is due to the population not having stabilized yet, as most are looking for opportunities, for livelihood opportunities in several locations before settling down more permanently. Cash-based assistance is an important element of the humanitarian relief effort. The government has recognized this as the most flexible modality to provide for immediate needs and has announced a one-time financial assistance for all refugees, including a 6-month rental subsidy. And this cash assistance should then slowly be transferred into national systems. So there's a need, of course, that refugees don't receive specific assistance, refugee assistance, for a long time, but they should be, as soon as possible, included into national social protection schemes. Finally, the refugee response plan also calls for long-term support. I'm not sure if this can be achieved in 6 months, but it has to be kept in mind from the beginning, the need to bring in international financial institutions and development actors to do things like upgrading schools and hospitals that cannot cope with the number of new users at this moment, and that need to be increased because people are likely to stay. I mean, it's 100,000 people who arrived, and our estimate is that at least 85,000 or so would probably see a longer-term perspective inside Armenia, whereas others also are likely to move on to abroad because many Armenians have relatives in the EU or in other countries. So there is also an expectation of a considerable secondary movement. But coming back to long-term efforts, it's really important that development actors are now mobilized with their bigger money. I mean, these appealed 98 million will not all be paid, and there's more money needed to build infrastructure facilities and to create real resilience in the local communities for the long-term support of this new population. And that, as I said at the beginning, makes up almost 3% of the Armenian population. It's really 1 out of 30 inhabitants. Imagine if this happened in a country like Germany or France all of a sudden, from one week to the other, basically. Now, there is you see the slide, and I think we can probably later distribute the presentation, and also you have access to this. There's a link to this refugee response plan, and that you can easily Google, and there's also a link on the presentation. Of course, you cannot click it from here. Maybe some population figures here. You see that most of the persons arrived are women, 30% are children, and you see an overview of the key figures here, how much is to be expended for how many refugees are to be assisted, and how many locals also who are hosting the newly arrived refugees and the ones that were already there. Here on this slide, you can see again the overall financial requirements and the number of agencies that are participating in the appeal, and how much money is actually being appealed for national, international NGOs and for UN agencies. It's not mentioned here explicitly. I think UNHCR alone is appealing for its own needs for some $14 million US until next March. Here you can see on this slide, you can see a division of the different sectors, assistance sectors, protection, shelter, resilience, cash assistance. You see is a big part of the response to support the government in providing sufficient means for refugees to sustain themselves. And cash assistance is, of course, the most flexible means of providing some dignified means of survival for refugees in a country such as Armenia. Now, let me turn to solutions. This is probably an issue that goes away now from the refugee response plan, but it's looking a little bit into the future. And here, allow me to quote our High Commissioner, Mr. Filippo Grandi, who stated just 2 days ago on 9 October at UNHCR's Executive Committee meeting in Geneva. And there's the quote, which you also see on the screen. He said, whenever time comes, UNHCR is ready to discuss solutions for the IDPs and the refugees with Armenia and Azerbaijan. UNHCR has actually been ready to do so since the origin of the situation in the 1990s.
You have 1 more minute.
As part of its mandate, UNHCR stands ready, therefore, to work on solutions, including return in safety and dignity, in compliance with human rights for all refugees and internally displaced persons. Peaceful settlement of conflicts is essential for UNHCR and other actors of the humanitarian community to engage in meaningful work and support implementation of durable solutions, respect for human rights and confidence-building measures. What we do in repatriation operations often, for instance, are go and see visits in this context, are also important factors that help the work of UNHCR and the humanitarian community. UNHCR will be anxious to contribute to these efforts, disseminate good practices, and provide technical support to all parties. Thank you.